Action is a sculpture of a movie camera. It's based on an old movie camera that I've had in my studio for some time. A little bit different to this camera, which is the camera that all the animated films were made on for many years. So on the one hand, it's a kind of personal talisman. It's not exactly a self-portrait, though there's something of the portliness of and the short legs of the camera in the sculpture which feel a kind of self-portrait. It started off as a tiny sketch in a notebook, expanded from the tiny sketch in a notebook to a sculpture that you could hold in your hand as if you were holding the word camera. And then it was enlarged to a scale, a sort of large tabletop scale, which is not a straightforward enlargement. A lot of the objects, there's difference to what it is to look down on a small sculpture or to look straight on at a tabletop sculpture and to look up at a 3.5 meter sculpture. So the height of the belly above the ground, the length of the legs, the angle of the lens, whether it was looking up or down, all of these things change and are adjusted while making the sculpture. The first sculpture is made out of wax, which is cast in bronze. The next one starts off maybe with a kind of polyurethane foam inside, which is then covered with wax and shaped. And the large one had a sort of a 3D printed enlargement made in polystyrene to give the rough bulk and shape. And then it was reshaped with a mixture of a machete and an electric carving knife to adjust the basic form, and then covered with plaster of Paris, and the plaster of Paris carved into and scraped into, and new sections added, and a top cut off, and then its angle changed. And once the large plaster of Paris version of the full-scale sculpture was made, it gets cut into sections and a mold made, and then the bronze cast from those molds, and then those sections welded together and ground down to get the surface that one had in the original plaster of Paris, which is a version that's somewhat different from the medium size and very different to the small size. So while making the sculpture, the work is essentially about the translation of scale and surface and working technique rather than meaning. And I've never really questioned what the meaning of the work is. I've never thought of it as a self-portrait until talking to you now, this moment. There's something, I suppose, of a Sunday Times comics section from my early childhood, the character called the Little King, who also had fat pointed legs and a good belly. And maybe there's an echo even of this childhood image in the sculpture. It's certainly a sculpture which is about a technology which I used to use but don't use nearly as much. In South Africa, there are no longer film laboratories that will process 35mm film. And so we've moved per force to a digital making of images. Like this film is now filmed in a digital form rather than in a celluloid film form like the old camera. There is something, I suppose, of the heroic in it, in its size and its confidence. But more than that, I couldn't say what it means. The world on its hind legs. The world on its hind legs had many different origins in the studio as graphic works as drawing. It was an animation of a set of legs, like two pylons marching from the opera I made with Handspring Puppet Company, written by Jane Taylor, called Zeno at 4 a.m., and where we used a lot of shadow figures of legs moving across a landscape. And in that, the world was the size of a head on the top of these tall pylon legs. And I did a project for an Italian newspaper, which were 4 drawings to go on the back page of the newspaper over 4 successive weeks. And in that, the world grew, or the circle, the head on the pylon legs grew to the idea of the whole world walking along. And so it's existed in different forms. So the image of the sphere, not of Atlas carrying the world on his shoulders or the heavens on his shoulders, but rather of the world itself picking itself up by its own bootstraps and walking along, is an image that is intriguing. It partly has to do with the simplicity of a circle being the world and two triangles being the legs. And as soon as you have two triangles, 2 points, you automatically have a sense of walking, whether it's simply a pair of some scissors that are walking along, or the pair of triangles. Where are my biggest scissors? Are they here somewhere? Don't worry, are they not back there? Yeah. So whether it's as soon as you have two objects joined in the middle, you have a sense of legs that can walk. So if we take off the handles and simply put a disc over there, we're already making a kind of world on its hind legs. So that's one element of the sculpture, and it's existed in smaller forms and in the larger forms. But the other point about the sculpture, it has to do with a provisionality of coherence. There's only one position from which you can see the image of the world on its hind legs. So it's a kind of anti-sculpture. It should be three-dimensional, but it only makes visual sense from one position with one eye, as if you're slightly below the level of the balcony outside, opposite the garden at the foundation. But you get a sense of it from the balcony looking towards the sculpture with the world on its hind legs against its white plates. But from all other places, the coherence of the image disintegrates and you're left with a kind of abstract mess. So it's very much about the way we put fragments together to make things coherent. We see half of something but imagine what the other half is. We hear half a sentence and imagine what the other part could have been. We nearly understand a foreign language, but the words that we don't understand we fill in for ourselves as if we are taking this fragmented view of the world on its hind legs and putting it together into a single coherent image. So it's very much about the way we make meaning in the world, not only meaning of the sculpture, but of all of our daily living.